Previously on Alan Wake.
One of the best games to come out of the 7th generation of consoles was Alan Wake, a third-person action horror where you use light as a means of offense and defense. Alan Wake was developed by Remedy Entertainment following their success with the first 2 Max Payne games. Upon its release, it was met with critical praise and despite soft sales, went on to become a cult classic. Recently, the game celebrated its 10th anniversary, which made me feel all sorts of old. With this milestone, as well as those fun teases in Control, I thought it would be a great excuse to dust off this gem and see how it's held up. Is Alan Wake still a beacon of light a decade after release, or has this bulb burned out? Grab your Energizer batteries and your comic relief, and let's find out. The story of Alan Wake is presented like an episodic TV show, complete with an opening recap and ending credits for each of the game's 6 episodes. Alan Wake is a world-famous author known for his best-selling character, Alex Casey, a New York detective out for revenge after his wife and baby daughter were murdered. That sounds familiar.
Shh, baby, just another nightmare. Everything's fine.
Burned out and suffering writer's block, Alan and his wife Alice traveled to Bright Falls, Washington to have themselves a romantic getaway. After arriving at their frankly dope-looking island cabin on Cauldron Lake, Alice is suddenly attacked by a dark presence which drags her into the blackness of the lake, with Alan jumping in after her.
Oh no!
Wake up.
Alice?
Suddenly, the author reawakens a week later with no memory of what happened up to this point. And worse yet, no idea where his wife is.
I couldn't remember how I got there. All I knew was that something terrible had happened to Alice.
Combat is the best part of Alan Wake. At first glance, it may look like your typical third-person shooter, and for the most part it is, but what makes Alan Wake special is the use of light as a weapon. Your enemies in Alan Wake are the Taken, citizens of Bright Falls who have been possessed by the dark presence. Their crazed ramblings might come off a bit goofy at times,
Omega-3 fatty acids are good for your heart.
but their overall look is frightening, being otherwise normal-looking blue-collar workers enveloped by smoking darkness, violent silhouettes out for blood. The darkness within the Taken protects them from harm, and the only thing that kills the darkness is direct contact with light. So the protocol with every enemy is to shine your flashlight on them, drain them of darkness until they are vulnerable, and then drain, pop, bang. This is the simple and satisfying gameplay loop of Alan Wake, and what's brilliant is that Remedy managed to keep that loop fun throughout the whole 10-hour experience.
My head pounded with a concussion. I'd never fired a gun outside a shooting range, and now I just killed someone. Or something.
Alan's arsenal is straightforward but effective. You have a 6-shooter revolver that will be your workhorse. It's not the strongest weapon, but it's the most reliable, and it has the most ammo available. Then you have a long gun, either a shotgun coming in the double barrel and pump action variety, or a rifle, all great for taking on the big boys. The key to combat is managing the horde of enemies and giving Alan enough breathing room to literally light them up. You always have to keep an eye on your batteries. Shining your beam quickly drains battery life, and while they do recharge, sometimes you just have to pop in newer ones when you're in a jam. Enemies can easily flank you. If an enemy gets too close, then Alan can do a last-minute dodge, which is shown off with a cool slow-mo effect. If you get overwhelmed, the player is also able to hold or throw out flares, or you can use the insta-killing flare gun or flashbangs as a last resort. Early on, enemy encounters are out in more open wooded areas. Enemies typically spawn in front of you, with maybe 1 or 2 coming at you from behind. By the time you reach the later episodes, Taken are coming at you from every direction, but the player has traps and turrets at their disposal to help even up the odds.
You gotta be kidding me.
Taken aren't Alan's only foes. Inanimate objects can also be possessed by the darkness, ranging from metal barrels to full-on construction equipment. These were my least favorite fights in the game. Objects take the longest to drain, and it can be difficult to gauge when they are going to strike you. Plus, the game loves putting you in cramped environments with these guys, which all but guarantees a few deaths that are firmly on the cheap side. Crows can swoop at you with very little warning. Luckily, they can be driven back with your flashlight or destroyed altogether with a well-placed flare. The sections where you run into these avian adversaries are actually pretty enjoyable and another great way to keep players on their toes. In most combat situations, you have the option of running to a safe zone and foregoing the fight altogether. Now, there were a few spots in the game where I was forced to do this, but for the most part, I stood my ground, primarily because the combat is just so damn enjoyable. It's so frantic and desperate, and the way the enemies erupt in a flurry of lights after a good drain pop bang just dumps dopamine all over my brain. Plus, the bit of slow-mo when you finish off the last enemy is a great touch. That's the thing with Remedy, this company just knows how to make fun, simple, and cool combat systems that never get boring. In Max Payne, it was bullet time. In Control, it was manipulating the environment with your mind. And in Alan Wake, it's using light. Phenomenal stuff. If I had any complaints, it's that the game is always finding ways for Alan to lose all of his stuff, forcing the player to recollect their weapons multiple times within each episode. Now, initially, this is done as a smart way to teach the player the mechanics of the weapons. So, for example, when the game introduces flares, the player is limited to using only flares. That way, they can get a feel for how they work and when to use them. But when you hit the later portions of the game, it can be annoying watching a fully equipped Alan have all of his weapons stripped away. I just wish there was more of a sense of progression and building up of Alan's arsenal. Also, the game is a little too generous with the ammo and batteries. I mean, there are literally boxes full of ammo all over this game and packs of Energizer batteries. Yes, Energizer batteries. Makes sense, but the product placement is still cringeworthy. Ugh. It's unlikely you'll ever find yourself hurting for batteries and ammo in this game, at least on the normal difficulty. And since the game in general leans more on the easy side, I don't think it would have been the worst thing in the world to have more limited resources. Sometimes the game breaks up its major set pieces with vehicle sections, sometimes at night but mostly during the day. Alan Wake was originally developed to be an open world game. In fact, the design of the open world was completed before Remedy decided to shrink the scope and make the game a linear action title. These brief sections are the remnants of that original build. They do offer a nice breather, a chance for players to freely explore and appreciate Alan Wake's well-crafted environments, which we'll get to in a second. The driving isn't great though. The vehicles handle like you're driving on ice, but I do appreciate that one of the cars looks like Ash's hunk of junk from The Evil Dead, and all of Sam Raimi's movies actually.
Alan! Where are you? Help!
Another element that has aged incredibly well is the game's visual presentation. What surprised me the most is how good the environments still hold up. I often say this current generation is when developers really got the hang of doing outdoor environment, but playing Alan Wake, I realized how much Remedy was ahead of the curve. Once again, Alan Wake takes place in the Pacific Northwest, specifically Washington State. And since yours truly was born and raised in Washington State, I can confidently say Remedy nailed it. Of course, it's exaggerated as any video game would be, but the way the forest looks with its tall pines, thick fog, and endless wet brush is very accurate. But the frosting on this cake is of course the game's lighting, which remains absolutely stunning. The way light and shadow behave is incredibly realistic and totally sells the game's atmosphere. Light and shadow are something that we gamers take for granted now, but back when Alan Wake first came out, it was a big deal how well they nailed this aspect, and it still holds up even today.
Sheriff Sarah Breaker, you are...
I'm Alan Wake, but listen, I was in a car crash. My wife Alice, she's missing.
Calm down, Mr. Wake.
We were staying in a cabin on the island, on Cauldron Lake.
There's no island on Cauldron Lake, not since the big eruption in the 70s.
Episode 2 is when the story goes into full gear. Alan is frantically searching for his wife, the cabin they were staying at has disappeared, and a mysterious manuscript, seemingly written by Wake himself, is predicting all of it.
I'd forgotten there were still places like this. Towns where everybody knew everybody.
The biggest compliment I can pay to Alan Wake's story is how believable Bright Falls is. The locations and the people that populate them, no matter how zany, are very well realized. Remedy went out of their way to create a rich backstory and lore for this little PNW nook, and while this is a huge cliche, I think it's true for Alan Wake. The setting is the best character of the game. Now, I said that was my biggest compliment, mainly because it might be my only one. There's a lot to be critical of in Alan Wake's narrative.
Hey, nobody move! Get your hands off of my client!
Who are you?
I'm Barry Wheeler, his agent.
Episode 2 is also where we meet Barry. Imagine if Danny DeVito and Joe Pesci had a baby and decided to homeschool it. That's Barry.
I don't like it, Al. I don't like any of it. It's not good. In fact, it's the absolute opposite of good.
Barry is Alan's manager and serves as the game's comic relief.
I'm always right about everything, and if I don't get my way, I'll sulk all day long.
He is not an awful character. character, but he is a great example of how wildly the tone of this game can swing. See, Alan Wake may take influence from Stephen King and David Lynch, but in reality it has the soul of an 80s action movie, exemplified by the fact that there is indeed an 80s action movie sidekick in the game.
Guess that one saw the light, huh? You didn't like that one? A tough audience. Well, I got plenty more.
The early episodes do feel like something out of a Stephen King novel, dark and psychological, with these little Twin Peaks influences sprinkled about. But then the last 3 episodes get to be pretty goofy, starting with a Taken battle royale at a farmhouse rock and roll stage, which eventually leads to battling in the streets of Bright Falls with the sheriff and Barry, who happens to be dressed in Christmas lights. No, the tonal shift of frightening to goofy doesn't clash as much as you'd think, and these sections are really fun to play through, don't get me wrong, but these choices were a little off-putting. Another big example is Agent Nightingale.
This is Agent Nightingale, FBI! Get him up, Hemingway! You're under arrest!
Agent Nightingale blames Wake for the death of his partner, who was taken over by the darkness. His grief led him to alcoholism and being fired from the FBI. Nightingale is blatantly trying to kill Alan, although how he's been able to fool the Bright Falls police force into thinking he's still an active FBI agent is beyond me.
What are? I'm standing right here, you goddamn maniac!
He literally sicks an army of cops at you, which leads to this huge chase in the woods that features a brief helicopter chase. Once again, former FBI agent. Not sure how he managed this. I have to wonder if this was just Microsoft Games executives complaining that there wasn't enough action in the game. I don't think this sequence belongs in the game, and I don't think Nightingale adds anything to the narrative. Here's the thing with Remedy. All of their games have these really interesting concepts and these incredibly fleshed out worlds with great backstories and side narratives that do complement the main story. But when it comes to the actual storytelling, they can be a bit clumsy. With Alan Wake, one of its other main problems is its narration.
Once upon a time, I was a successful writer, but that was a long time ago. I hadn't been able to write a word in 2 years.
Now, Remedy used a lot of narration in Max Payne 1 and 2, but it fit the film noir style of those games and complemented the comic book style cutscenes. And who doesn't love Max's one-liners?
I don't know about angels, but it's fear that gives men wings.
But in Alan Wake, it's overused, often over-explaining stuff that any player paying a lick of attention can figure out.
I had to figure a way out of this. Any second now, and Stucky would be knocking on the door with his axe like Nicholson in The Shining.
Sometimes it's nice during gameplay in terms of hints or showing what Alan may be thinking, but beyond that, it's largely unnecessary.
The garage was a mess. It looked like someone had trashed the place, or that there'd been some kind of fight.
While narration can be used in cool ways to flesh out a character, most of the time it serves as a narrative crutch, and it is my belief that it's always more satisfying and effective to have your audience learn important information in a story organically through showing rather than having a voice tell it to them. The most egregious example of this is the climax when we finally learn what's actually going on. Alan and Barry survive a rocking skirmish on a Viking farm and decide to get drunk off some hallucinogenic moonshine. For reasons.
I'm a writer, goddammit.
Correct.
If I just wanted to, I could write 10 books a year.
Alan then dreams of the night when Alice was taken. Right off the bat, Alan is explaining stuff that frankly the player is smart enough to figure out.
It was a crazy drunken dream, and yet it was more than that. It was the truth. A suppressed memory unearthed by the Andersons' moonshine.
And before you know it, Alan remembers everything and just starts breaking it down for the player.
Even with the cobwebs she put in my head, some part of me had been aware enough to write my escape into the story, to bring a light into the cabin to release me before I could finish, to interrupt the horror story before the ending, where darkness consumed everything and everyone.
And it just flattens the whole story. Now, some of you would argue, Kirk, they needed to do this because the story of Alan Wake is so complicated that there's no real way to effectively show it. To which I would reply, then you need to rewrite and simplify your story. And simplifying would have been great because Alan Wake is capital C confusing. I mean, you have this dark entity living in Cauldron Lake that can take over people and manipulates creatives to manifest things into reality. Okay, so that's what happened to Alan, alright. But then you have Alan subconsciously write a man into his story to rescue him from the dark place. And then it turns out that man wrote into the story the thing that Alan would need to stop the dark presence, which he did decades before when he was the previous victim of the lake. And he might have been the cause of Alan Wake coming to Bright Falls in the first place, because he wrote it into his story.
I'd given the clicker to Alice, yet it was here. Zane had written it into existence in a story I had written.
Wait, what? Okay, so are you trying to tell me that the Deus Ex Machina that Alan wrote into the world also wrote another level of Deus Ex Machina that would eventually defeat the Dark Presence? What, did J.K. Rowling ghostwrite this? And of course, the game ends on a bizarre cliffhanger.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
The game's DLC episodes, The Signal and The Writer, do a decent job of explaining what's going on at the end of the game and do set things up for a sequel. But let's be real here, it took another game from Remedy to offer an explanation of what happened in Bright Falls and what the Dark Presence might be, which is really cool world building for sure, but not super satisfying storytelling. And yes, in case it's not clear, Alan Wake and Control are in the same universe.
I'm going back to the lake to finish this. I'm going to write an ending to the story in the manuscript on my own terms, to make it all right.
Okay, let's switch gears here. While I'm largely critical, there are good things about this story. One thing I thought worked, for the most part, was Alan's character arc. Now, I have to be honest, I have a hard time connecting with Alan as a character in general. I don't think he's the most likable guy in the world, that's just me. But you come to learn that Alan is burned out, borderline alcoholic, borderline abusive, and is taking his life for granted. It's only when his wife is taken away that Alan sheds his demons, literally and metaphorically, and uses his talent selflessly to save the day. I appreciated this arc, it's effective. I think if the game had put a laser focus on this and didn't concern itself with crazy, twisting plot devices, I think the story would have turned out way better. Although one plot device that I thought worked pretty well was the manuscript, at least in terms of how it functions.
The loose sheets of paper were pages from a manuscript entitled Departure. That was the name I planned to use for the next novel I had never gotten started.
Early on, Alan discovers, strewn about the environment, the pages of a manuscript written by himself. Stranger yet, the manuscript is detailing, accurately, all of the events happening to him.
Barry saw the darkness attack the visitor center. It made him a believer. The men Al said he'd shot, they hadn't been just locals on crank.
The manuscript pages you collect do a great job at teasing the player with future events, but they also effectively flesh out the side characters around you. A good example is Alice and Rusty. Through the pages, you discover that the two have unrequited feelings for each other, a fact made tragic by their grim fates in the story.
Rose knew that Rusty was in love with her, and she liked him too. She liked him a lot. He taught her to dance.
This is something that doesn't belong in the main narrative, but helps further flesh out the setting and actually allows for a payoff for relatively unimportant scenes.
I was just bringing Rusty some coffee. He's on the balcony, looking after Max. Poor thing.
It's techniques like this that help players better connect with their setting, and once again, the biggest compliment I can pay to Alan Wake is how well it establishes its setting. So after 10 years, has Alan Wake held up? Yes, beautifully. It's miles from perfect. Obviously, I am not impressed by its overly complicated story full of literary no-nos, but its satisfying and addictive combat and incredibly realized environments nudge this game into the classic territory. I think this is one of those games everyone should play before they die. I really do. And while you can currently get it dirt cheap on Steam, GOG, or Xbox Back Compat, I really hope this game gets some sort of remaster or re-release in the future so more people can play it. And if it's not asking too much, maybe through a remaster, Remedy could clean up some of the messier storytelling. There is that Control DLC coming soon, which hopefully will shed some light on the potential future of Alan Wake. We'll just have to see. But what do you guys think? Anybody have some great memories of playing Alan Wake or have some theories on what could come next? Be sure to let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to click subscribe and hit that like icon. I post videos weekly, so ring the bell so you are the first to see them. I'm Kirk, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.